Roadmap is the acronym of European Observatory on Disaster Risk and Crisis Management Best Practices. The project is now at about half of its duration. So today we will have this second webinar. And in my short presentation, I will just give you, all of you an update on the project so that you can learn about the main advances of Roadmap project. Before starting, I would like to recall and acknowledge and thank the partner of the consortium that is running the Roadmap project, which is the CI3R, the Italian Center for Risk Reduction, the Italian Civil Protection Department, then we have ADAI from Portugal, and the University of Stavanger. And my special thank as a project coordinator to the group of University of ADAI, coordinated by Professor Domingo Viegas, for the perfect organization of this webinar and for the management of this webinar. Roadmap is basically a project where we are trying to collect and share and disseminate information about best practice in disaster risk management. And we do this by different means that we have declared in the project. So first, one of the tools we have to share information, knowledge, and opinions with the community is bulletins. So as of now, we have already some bulletins out. One was, the first one was focused on the project presentation, so it was an introductory bulletin. Then we started with more focused bulletins. So the second one dealt with the multi-hazard risk, where we tried to analyze this concept in interaction with pandemic. It's so in the pandemic context. And then the third one has been focused on the forest fires. All these bulletins can be found online. And then we have other dissemination tool as the thematic papers. We are working and will be finalized anytime in December, a thematic paper 1. According to the project, we selected 2 experts that I thank, and they are contributing to the finalization of this first thematic paper. We expect totally 3 thematic papers. So the second one is due in February 2022, and this is also for me an opportunity to share with all people connected the fact that we have still active a call for 2 experts. This time, this call is about a contribution to the second thematic paper. The deadline for application is December the 10th, and this is a call for expertise online. So if you directly or any of your co-workers can be interested, please give a look and maybe send the application. Then we will have a third thematic paper 2 months later, so in April 2022. One of the main objective of this project, I would say the main objective, is the definition of a solutions explorer, which should help us to identify gaps in the disaster risk management knowledge center, and we are working on this solution explorer by a strong interaction with the DG ECO. We are conceiving this solution explorer as an open source web platform that could be able to host good practice in disaster risk management at different levels. So it's a multi-level idea where we can locate on this platform different experience and best practice coming from local, regional, national, or international arena. Of course, the platform is conceived as an open tool, so will be allow people to search and browse for the contents that we upload on the platform. As I told, we are assuring that this could be interoperable with disaster risk management knowledge center resources, so that this tool could be used even after, of course, the project duration. This was a key issue about the sustainability of this product. So the idea is to design and produce a tool that could be available to the project partners, but also to all stakeholders. We open it to general public at the end of the project. Actually, we are also interacting with other colleagues in other projects of this call in order to make sure that we have compatibility of from an IT point of view, but also in terms of content, because our final goal is to produce really something useful to our citizens and our community. Today, we are about to start the second webinar. This is coming after the first one, which was held in June 25th. That one was about the nexus between scientists and decision makers in the disaster risk management. We have more than 200 attendees, and you see the speakers. Again, special thanks to the speakers. I don't read the names that you can see, but this was really a very interesting and fruitful meeting. When I say fruitful, I mean fruitful for the development of our activities since the summer of 2021. I'm about to close my presentation, and I would like to stress the fact that we think that Roadmap project will be one of the main contribution in the knowledge network. So we are strongly linked to the activities that are conducted at European level. And we understand that we can have an important role in the UN Civil Protection Knowledge Network. Actually, just tomorrow, there will be the launch of the knowledge network and the online platform. And we have committed to produce material, information, and experiences that could enrich and contribute to this initiative of the European community. For any other detail that I could not deal with in my short presentation, please check out the website of the project, roadmap.ci3r.it, and where you can find information as now, but also to follow our initiatives in the next months. With this, I end my presentation. I thank you all, and I give the floor to my colleague, Professor Viegas, which will moderate and manage the rest of the webinar. Thank you. Domingos, the microphone, please.
Thank you, Andrea. And I would like to say good morning once again to our speakers and to all the attendees in this webinar. So as Andrea said, we are about to start our second webinar on a very important problem of disaster risk management, that is the communication of the risk. This is a very complex problem and has many dimensions. We have today three specialists to address this problem under these three topics that you can see their titles in the program. So in the following, I'll give the word to each one of our speakers. The first one will be Dr. Nicola Nocenzo. Nicola is a science writer specialized in scientific communication with over 20 years of experience at the national and international level. He has a Master of Science in Science Communication and works currently for Nature Journal. Besides his journalistic work, Nicola Nocenzo worked as a communicator for the Italian Space Agency, the Italian Institute of Astrophysics, and for the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Lausanne. He wrote 3 books for the general public and has worked with the Italian public broadcasting company, RAI, for projects and programs on science and technology. Please, Nicola.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for the introduction. And I will just, in a second, start sharing my screen, hoping you can see it all right.
Yes.
Okay, so as per the introduction, I am a science journalist and currently working for Nature Italy in particular, not Nature, for which I have contributed many years, mostly as a correspondent from Italy, but currently editing a regional edition of Nature dedicated to Italy. And as a science journalist, as for most science journalists, my attention over the last almost 2 years now has been kind of monopolized by the COVID-19 crisis. So although I also have some experience in covering risks or even in communicating risks from the institutional side on other types of risks, including natural and man-made disasters, I thought to focus this presentation on the COVID-19 crisis, because in addition to many things that have made this period unique, the COVID-19 crisis really has been a long experiment on risk communication, unprecedented in many ways. Actually, you can say that it has been many different experiments, because along the different phases of the pandemics, we have actually witnessed the transition towards different styles and needs of risk communication, going from the purely crisis emergency mode during the initial phase when most of the characteristics of the pandemic were unknown, into the next phases when the crisis kind of chronicized and also the rules of risk communications changed. But so I wanted to look a bit into the lessons that we have learned during these months and how they can be transported also to other areas of risk communication. First, a few words on what made this pandemic so special in terms of risk communication, what factors kind of made it a perfect storm for risk communication, with a combination of factors that made the challenge of communicating risks during this period so unique and so challenging for policymakers, for journalists, for professional communicators inside the institutions, for scientists, for everyone. First, we had a problem of a global risk, a pandemic, by very definition, a global risk that was mostly managed through national policies. So we always, and also risk communication was very much conducted at the national level through national policies by national choices. And this sometimes resulted into conflicting choices. It turned out to be an unpredictably long crisis, literally. I mean, we kept, if you think about it, for almost 2 years now, we've kept projecting the end of the crisis soon, and probably most of us 1 year ago, if we were told that at this stage, at this date, we would still be, wondering whether we will be able to travel freely for Christmas, it would have sounded far-fetched. So the duration of the crisis has been, from the very beginning, really difficult to predict and to factor in. There has always been, especially in the very early phases, but throughout the crisis, a huge level of scientific uncertainty around the actual dimensions of the risk. The crisis had heavy geopolitical implications because of the origin of the pandemic in China, the conflict, the level of conflict between states that appeared during the pandemic due to the impact of the travel restriction, to the impact on trade, to the back and forth accusation between countries of lack of transparency, etc. And there was also quite evident from the beginning a certain level of conflict between different risks. The health risk from the disease itself, of course, but also the risk to the welfare of the population posed by the measures themselves to contain the risk. And at some point, it became evident to everyone that communicating both kinds of risks and finding a balance between them was to be one of the main challenges. Also, one can look for some specific traits of the COVID-19 risk that allow to compare it to other risks that have been studied and that are known in the literature, also in the literature about risk communication. And from this slide on, I will, in several points of my presentation, quote quite heavily from an article that came out this year in the Journal of Risk Research, and you find the full reference at the bottom of this slide, and it's called "The Risk Communication and COVID-19 in Europe, Lessons for Future Public Health Crisis." But I think one could take health out of the title, because the lessons are really for crisis in general. And it is based on a comparison of the COVID-19 policies in 5 European countries: UK, Germany, France, Switzerland, and Sweden. And that is why you will find quite a bit of examples from this country in the countries in the rest of the presentation. So some key characteristics of the COVID-19 risk. One important risk dimension we know from the risk communication literature is whether risks are perceived as controllable by voluntary actions by the individual. Because we know that people tend to have a more optimistic view of risks that they perceive as controllable by their own will, whether that is actually true or not. So, for example, people tend to underestimate the risk posed by smoke or by obesity, because they are perceived as risks that they can be controlled by their own will. While on the other hand, the risks such as those posed by genetic modified organisms, I mean, whatever you can think about them, but at least on the health level, or on natural disasters, those are perceived as not controllable by the individual, and so they can be overestimated. In this sense, COVID has some contradictory aspects, because on some level, especially in the first phase of the pandemic, because the unknown nature, it was very much perceived as a non-controllable risks. Then, when the characteristics of the spreading of the infection became clear, there were also in some parts of the population some aspects of underestimation of the risk, because a feeling that the appropriate behaviors could help control it set in. We know people tend to have a more pessimistic perception of risks that have a catastrophic potentials, risks that can cause a higher number of fatalities in single event or in a shorter period of time, like aviation accidents as compared to road accidents. That's a classic example of risks that are where actually the latter is much more significant in terms of absolute numbers, but tends to be underestimated by people. And in this sense, COVID-19, especially again in the first phase, was clearly perceived with the risk with a catastrophic potential, and there were also psychometric experiments confirming this perception. People also worry less about hazards that are less visible, and this is clearly the case of an infectious disease, in particular one such as this one that can transmit between asymptomatic people, which was an extremely peculiar characteristic of this crisis. And a low level of scientific clarity about the nature, the dimension of the risk and its possible future evolution also adds to the risk perception. And in this case, we've been really battling with a lot of scientific uncertainty throughout the course of the crisis. A final concept that I would like to introduce and that has been used in relation to COVID-19, but that could very well become a permanent feature of major risks in the current information ecosystem, is that of an infodemic. The quotes that you find in this slide come from a paper that is actually still under embargo, as we journalists say, that is still in press as of today. It will be published later during this week in the Cell journal about the infodemic that was connected to COVID-19. And the term infodemic has been used for quite some time in the risk communication literature and in the information literature, initially to refer to the amplification effect of the news about the progenitor to COVID, the SARS, the severe respiratory syndrome from 2003. Then later it was mostly attached to the element of misinformation spreading rapidly through social media. But currently most researchers who focus on how information is contributing to the perception of risks, and in particular to the COVID-19 crisis, focused on a more general definition that defines infodemic as an overabundance of information, whether accurate or not, that can occur during an epidemic. And so, surely it has occurred in this case, simply a too big amount of information for people to process and to digest and to distinguish between reliable and unreliable information. I'd like to touch very briefly on what is risk communication. And I just wanted to quickly quote the official definition that you find on the website, on the literature of the World Health Organization, because I think it is a quite appropriate definition. And it is nice that it uses some terms that are bidirectional and not just top-down or monodirectional. The WHO defines risk communication as the real-time exchange of information, advice, and opinion between experts or officials and people who face a threat to their survival. So not just from officials and from scientists to the general public, but the exchange of information that goes in two ways. And its ultimate purpose is that everyone at risk is able to take informed decisions to mitigate the effects of the threat. So before aiming to determine behavior in people, the goal of risk communication should be to make everyone able to take informed decisions. That may sound obvious on some level, but it is not always obvious in the practice of risk communication. Now, again, quoting from the paper in the Journal of Risk Research that I was referring to earlier, there are a few specific topics on which the analysis of those authors focus to try to compare the approach that was taken in different countries to the risk communication of COVID-19. One first dimension that is very important is who speaks, whose voice was selected to be the main voice speaking to the people during the crisis. And here we saw relatively different examples across countries. In the UK, the choice was to base the communication around typically events, press conferences with one minister, or very often the prime minister himself, surrounded by one or two consultants, one or two scientific experts. That that one with Boris Johnson at the center was a typical setting of the communication in the UK. In Germany, for some time, Angela Merkel, also thanks to her own scientific background, kind of filled both roles and was really the center of the country's communication on the crisis, although it was always made very clear to the public that decisions were informed by the scientific advice of the Robert Koch Institute. In Switzerland, the communication was really very much focused on two people that were basically the voice of the crisis for all Swiss people, who were a member of the Federal Council, Alain Berset, who acts like a sort of health minister, and basically the chief scientific advisor, the head of the main scientific body in charge of scientific accountancy, Daniel Koch. And in the US, as we know, this is my own addition because it is not included in the paper, the analysis of the US, but as we know, we also had a communication that was very much focused on one political figure and one scientific figure, meaning the then president Donald Trump and Anthony Fauci, but with very often a very visible disconnect between them two, sometimes actually literally visible in the body language during the events. I want to say a couple of words about Italy, although that is not included in the analysis in that paper, also because it is the country where I come from, and so is an example that as an Italian citizen I followed quite a bit. Now, although I have to say that, you know, one can make many different considerations, but I think that being the first country hit so hard by the pandemic with so much unknown at the time, overall Italy has displayed a fairly good handling of the pandemic as a whole. But in terms of risk communications, there were surely phases when the choice made to have several different institutions communicating, from a scientific technical committee set up by the civil protection, the health minister himself, the higher council for health, which is yet another scientific body, special scientific consultants to the government, and then the whole local level, with the regions having their own health policies and their own press conferences and communication. This multiplicity of faces in key passages of the crisis resulted in confusion for the public. As an Italian living in Switzerland, because I currently live in Switzerland, I could not help but notice the striking difference between how the Swiss public only knew two faces, the one I've shown before, and the all institutional communication on the pandemic passed those through those two voices, and the multiplicity of voices in the Italian scenario. And to that, one has to add the fact that that has to be credited in part to the choices made by the media industry in Italy to interview and to look for as many scientific voices as possible to diversify their coverage. But to that, one has to add all the interviews and the opinions that, on top of the institutional communication, were given by scientific experts from universities, research centers, etc. That really created a situation that Italian readers may remember was at some point mocked satirically by social media users and by newspapers themselves, although they kind of created this situation very often. This was like a mock-up of a trading cards album, where instead of the football players, which is what you normally would have, and that is a popular tradition in Italy, where you have trading cards of virologists, because there were so many giving opinion in the media, that at some point it seemed like the audience could just choose the scientific advisors and experts that gave the recommendations that were simply closer to the desire of the individual. So this resulted in some confusion in the Italian communication. In general, I think one can say that we experienced in many countries a trajectory from a honeymoon phase where scientific experts were sometimes turned into kind of rock stars and at some point literally idolized. But we also experienced how fragile this unexpected and new popularity of scientific experts was. And here in the pictures, you have the examples of the Swedish main scientific expert, Andres Tegnell, who at some point early on in the pandemic became, as you may remember, the poster face of the Swedish approach to the pandemic, with a very high level of popularity, of personal popularity, and of personal visibility for him in the very first phase. And then when some cracks began to show in the Swedish model, a very quick fall from grace, and in fact also explicit actions from the Swedish government to kind of reclaim communication, risk communication on the political figures rather than on him. And the other, of course, is the very well-known case of Anthony Fauci, who was really at some point idolized by a part of the American public as the sober and the responsible face of risk communication and pandemic. But then also, let's say, his popularity at some point started to have some cracks, and overall, let's say that some limitations of this model of risk communication, very much focused on the personality of the scientist, became evident at some point. So a few, going on with the lessons that we have learned in terms of the role of both political figures and experts, it has been quite, it has become quite evident that an absolutely necessary requisite is to be able to lead by example. In the UK, for example, when both the political figure, Dominic Cummings, a member of Boris Johnson's cabinet, and the scientific figure as Niall Ferguson, a noted epidemiologist, when news came out that they had personally violated the COVID-19 restrictions to visit family members during the lockdown, that had a very heavy impact on the level of public trust and on the level of compliance in the public, as measured through several surveys in the UK. So leading by example is absolutely fundamental. Consistency among messages is also extremely important. Again, in the UK, some studies have measured that the rules on COVID-19 as communicated to the UK public has changed about 60 times between the onset of the pandemic and January 2021. And that has been shown to complicate a lot compliance and the level of trust in the government. And in fact, SAGE, the main advisory body to the UK government, has advocated at some point for a total reset of the communication on COVID-19 in November. But despite that, these inconsistencies and continuous change have continued beyond that. And again, while stressing that, of course, it was a very difficult situation, it was a very difficult job to communicate in that moment, and there was so much uncertainty about it. But one has to note that Italy, as the first country hit by the pandemic, was in the first phase is particularly inconsistent. That one is an image that the Italian public knows very well of one of Italy's political leaders, the then leader of the Democratic Party, prominently having an aperitif in Milan in late February, early March 2020 to signal that the city was still open and the life had to go on as usual. And then, of course, about 2 weeks later, the whole country entered into lockdown. So those rush to take absolute positions towards no risk at all or highest risk didn't really help. Perhaps the most striking and most damaging example of what several levels of inconsistency can do and the damage they can do in terms of risk communication was the AstraZeneca mess, where a lot of wrong things happened when the AstraZeneca vaccine was temporarily halted in the spring of 2021, but on the right hand of my slide, you have a fragment of a Financial Times article that at the time described how a lack of communication and a series of U-turns between individual government, the relationships between governments, in particular the German one, and its own scientific advisors, and then a lack of coordination between various national governments resulted in a situation that was extremely difficult for the public to understand. But I would say on top of that all, after saying for months on basically everything that concerned the drugs and vaccines, that everyone would wait what the European Medicine Agency would say. That was the refrain and the talking point used for vaccine approval throughout the months. In that occasion, we had the paradoxical situation of the European Medicine Agency that kept saying the vaccine is safe, benefits outweigh risks, there is no reason to suspend it, and individual governments taking the opposite decision. And that inconsistency between the institutions and between what most institutions had said up to that point, let's just listen to EMA and do what they say, and what was happening, did the permanent damage to the vaccination campaign. It is the opinion of many. Now, a few technicalities. These are simpler points, but the pandemic has also taught us a bit of very simple lessons of the communication techniques that work best or work a little less good. Message clarity in a crisis is, of course, extremely important, down to the very words used. And in fact, one can see that in the two phases, in the transition between two slogans that happened in the UK communication. The first phase was characterized by a slogan and an accompanying visual that was very much appreciated by the UK public, as many polls have shown, and that is documented in that paper in the Journal of Risk Research that I'm quoting from. Stay at home, protect the NHS, save lives. It very simply gives a quiet instruction on what people should do, and a quiet explanation of the rationale to do it. Later, when restrictions were partially eased, it was replaced by a variation on a theme: stay alert, control the virus, and save lives. That was instead much less appreciated, and in fact mocked quite a lot on social media by the British public, because of the, let's say, much lower level of clarity and much higher level of ambiguity that is in the message, because stay alert can mean a lot of different things. It is not a clear suggestion for the behavior. And also the visual language even itself, losing the difference in colors, etc., was much less effective. sorry, I think I've swept the two slides. I just want to go quickly with this one, and then I'll go back to the previous one. Also, this may sound very obvious, but another lesson that we were reminded of is of how visual formats and very effective and clear formats such as color codes can be helpful in summarizing complex indicators and help people cope with complicated messages and with complicated instructions. France was in fact basically the first country in Europe to adopt a color-based maps to highlight different risk levels across its areas and across different areas of the countries. Then this model was adopted by most other countries, and it has proven extremely helpful in guiding people towards navigating the variations of recommendations and restrictions throughout the countries and throughout the different periods. I want to then refer to what is possibly the most important topic, probably the most crucial that has emerged through the pandemic. That is the difficulty of communicating uncertainty. It is often assumed by scientists and policymakers, and it has also happened during this pandemic, that recognizing uncertainty could have negative consequences, signaling lack of competence, eroding trust, maybe encouraging panic and fear. But what we've seen through those experiences, through those inconsistencies early on, and also through cases such as the AstraZeneca experience, is that showing certainty and then being proven wrong is surely worse. One example again can come from Switzerland, where at some point the results of a model, basically of prediction model that projected ICU beds in the country to run out in a few weeks, and that was presented with too much certainty as a firm prediction, and was then did not come true, but actually it came through only with a few weeks of delay, with a few weeks of lag, backfired in terms of public trust and of public perception very much, and it took time for the government to recover from that.
Nicola, excuse me.
Yeah.
Nicola, excuse me. May I ask you to try to conclude as soon as possible, please?
Okay, I'll go towards the conclusion. I wanted to say a few things about how different framings of the communication campaign can influence perception. And I will just say quickly that experiences with the TV advertising, for example, of a social media campaign, have shown that messages based on fear and guilt are much less effective than ones based on solidarity, for example. Avoiding an us versus them mindset should be very much a focus of risk communications in this situation. I will just quickly say, these are all data that you find in that paper, so I will just quickly say that in all the 5 countries considered by that paper, France, Germany, Switzerland, Sweden, and UK, public trust has consistently been eroded throughout the pandemic. So that is as measured by surveys. And so that is overall a negative element that has to be considered and has to be factored in for the future, because at the end of the day, public trust is the basis for successful risk communication. There is one notable example, counter example at the international level that is worth looking into a little bit. That is New Zealand. New Zealand has had overall quite an amazing success, at least in the first phase, in the first year, in controlling the pandemic, and the level of public trust in the government and the Prime Minister in particular has been, with respect to other countries, sky high. And that has been attributed in part to the communication style of the prime ministers that has been extremely different from that of other countries. I will just say that although in the last months, the approval of the New Zealand prime minister has declined, it still remains higher than in many other countries. But it is interesting that it started to decline when Jacinda Ardern began to visibly disconnect from scientific advice and to take decisions that were partly criticized by her own scientific advisor, signaling that maybe, once again, inconsistency in one's approach is definitely damaging to public trust. A few recommendations. I will go very quick. I have a final slide that summarizes them all, so I can just use this final slide to conclude and to give a few lessons learned. These are a mix of the lessons learned as described in the paper from the Journal of Risk Communications and from further elaborations from myself on the examples that I've shown. We have learned that ensuring communication is consistent over time and avoiding U-turns is extremely important in order to achieve effective risk communications. Instructions should be clear and actionable to ensure public compliance. Leading by example and solidarity should be embedded in any risk communication strategy. Fear and guilt-based frames where the public, instead of decision makers, are blamed for the negative effects of the crisis are a no-go, are really not particularly effective in terms of risk communication. Bottom-up communication styles, such as that pioneered in New Zealand, rather than purely top-down communication, is definitely better. All communication campaigns should be pre-tested beforehand, preparing different scenarios and evaluate them before a crisis. The better model seems to be one where risk communications is informed by experts, but is actually led by elected officials, instead of making experts themselves the rock stars of science communication. And in bold, because that is possibly the most specific and most important lessons learned here, be totally transparent about uncertainty, acknowledge it, describe it, say we don't know much more often than it has been said during these 2 years, and show the process by which you hope to reduce uncertainty and tell the public how you will get there. But do not at any time sweep under the rug, hide the fact that a lot of the relevant science is still unknown. And so what you're giving the public is estimates and probabilities rather than certainties. And I think that is really a lesson that applies to many different categories of risks, and also very relevant for natural, man-made one, etc. So with that, I will conclude, and thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you very much, Nicola, for your excellent presentation on the COVID risk communication case, which is very important. Before giving the word to Ian Stewart, I'd like to give an information to all of those who joined us in the meeting that we are not going to share the presentations. The meeting will be recorded, is being recorded, and will be broadcast in the YouTube, so you can see and consult the presentations and the slides afterwards there. With no further delays, I will now invite Ian Stewart to give us his presentation on the advancing disaster risk communication towards people-centered approaches. Ian Stewart holds a research chair in sustainability in the Royal Scientific Society of Jordan. He is a visiting professor in environmental studies at Ashoka University in India, and is currently a professor of geoscience communication at the University of Plymouth in the UK. Being the founding director of the University of Plymouth's Sustainable Earth Institute, Ian has long-standing research interests are in natural hazards, sustainable geoscience, and earth science communication. His geocommunication work has built on a 50-year partnership with BBC Television, presenting geoscience programs, awarding a Royal Medal for his services to geography and geology education. He is the president of the Royal Scottish Geographical Society, has been communications lead for the Tomorrow Cities Urban Disaster Risk Consortium, and is a co-author of the United Nations Disaster Risk Reduction Global Assessment Report Chapter C3 on Advancing Risk Communication. Ian, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Domingos, and thank you for the invite to talk to you today. Thank you to Mauro Dolce, particularly for reaching out to me. If I share my screen and just check that you can see that full screen.
Yes, yes, it's okay.
And you can hear me okay?
Yes.
Fantastic. So, yeah, thank you again. Thank you to Nicola for setting out both some of the basic tenets of risk communication and also particularly from a journalistic perspective. So I'm a geoscientist, earthquake geologist by training, but as someone who's moved into popular communication and very much interested in science communication. And I'm going to take this perspective from the point of view of how do we better train our experts to start working in the kind of way that was mentioned by Nicola in various aspects. The WMO approach have been more people-centered in terms of what's expected for them. So this is outlines some of the work that I've been doing both within under the auspices of the Tomorrow Cities project, which is a UK-led but a global interdisciplinary research project looking at urban risk transitions, but also the work that I'm starting to do with the Royal Scientific Society here in Jordan. So let me introduce what I think is a challenge, and I'll outline in the first part the key challenges I think that we face within the DRR community. Everyone, I'm sure, as it knows the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction in 2015. But one of its key messages, underlying messages, is this notion that the risk management, disaster risk management, needs to be broader and more people-centered at tackling developing preventative attitudes towards disaster risk. And that means multi-hazard, that means multi-sectoral, being inclusive and accessible, in other words, to the actual, as was mentioned with the WMO, being accessible to those communities, those people that are actually going to be effective. And that's a kind of big cultural and mindset change for many risk specialists, the idea of how do you connect top-down, expert-driven risk management with the communities themselves. And this image really introduces where I've most recently been doing most of my work. This is Istanbul. This is one of the neighborhoods, earthquake-prone neighborhoods in Istanbul, whereby the old community neighborhoods have been ripped down because those buildings will not stand up to an earthquake, and modern apartments have been put in its place with the expectation that those will stay up in the next earthquake, even though there's now far more people living in those areas, those dangerous areas, than lived there before. And at the same time, there's been a erosion of the community spirit in that area as a result of risk management. So this is a complex, messy situation of risk management. And my interest is how we connect between the experts and the so-called non-experts. And I hope that there'll be quite a lot of overlap with what Nicola has been talking about. So one thing that I'd like to emphasize, I guess, is that we talk about disaster cycles, and it's kind of gone out of fashion now, the idea that it goes back to where it started. But there's certainly a notion of cyclicity of these repeating disasters. And I think an important point is that communication is different in different parts of the communication cycle. So we've already heard a little bit of that really coming through from the COVID example. I draw your attention to the response phase in red in that graph. That is the actual event, the crisis event. So I deal mainly with earthquakes and things like that. So it's very, very short-lived. And that is a period where communication really needs to be left to the emergency management experts. And actually, there's a real question about what the role of general scientists should play in that particular time period. It's often a time when the media are really interested in scientists, and scientists come out of the woodwork to comment. But really, that is a period where what we need is what's called actionable risk messaging, very clear instructions of what people should do in that times of crisis. I've never had to deal with that. It's not an area that I work on. And so I'm really going to be focusing on other parts of the cycle. And that's partly because I think actually a lot of the risk management will actually be in reducing the risk itself, and that's mitigation and preparedness in the lead up to the events. And in that case, the strategies for communication are very, very different from what they are in the emergency response phase. And that is a place where I think the risk experts and the hazard scientists can really get involved in a whole bunch of ways, and I'll talk about some of those. Another interesting one is the post-event period, which is a time that we actually, as scientists, as communicators, we often don't do much about. But actually, I think there's a whole lot of information that can be gathered, the narratives, the stories from people about what's happened and how things worked, how things didn't work. And the stories of the actual people who experienced the event, these kind of narratives can get fed back into the mitigation and preparedness phase. So I'm really saying the white, yellow, and orange areas of the disaster risk cycle are what I'm particularly interested in. So one of the things that I think is important, and Nicola's touched on this, is that we really need to understand the way that people make decisions. There's a 30, 40-year body of empirical evidence that happens to be from social sciences about how people make decisions, the work of Paul Slovic and his group and various people afterwards. And what we know is that people make decisions, particularly in disasters, in a time poor, so not much time, too much information, a lot of uncertainty, and a lot of fear and emotion. And that came really strongly through in Nicola's talk. But what we understand from the cognitive understanding of decision processing is that when people are faced with lots of complex information, what they tend to do is they make the decisions based on their values and beliefs. This is the idea of fast and slow thinking. Fast thinking is gut instinct. What do I feel about this? It's predicated by how I feel about the world. And the second phase, then, people know they've made a quick decision. They then search out for information that's going to essentially confirm their gut instinct, their short-term fast thought. And in doing so, will reject any information that counters that, because that actually forces them to reject their fundamental values and belief systems. And the shortcut, a cognitive shortcut that often does that, is trust in individuals. So people trust those who mirror their own values, which means that often that is not the technical experts. That is friends, that's families, that is media influencers, whoever it is, people who are acknowledged as not knowing about the technical information, but they're trusted by the individual. And then finally, and I think perhaps most importantly for us, opinions that aren't formed by logical facts, in other words, it's formed by this gut instinct, aren't necessarily influenced by logical or factual arguments. And that is something that scientists tend to forget, because we are based our whole ethos, our whole approach around logical factual arguments. And the expectation is that when the public say we need information, that what they want is logical factual arguments. And that's not necessarily the case. And that's something that we need to really address. And that image in the bottom right just highlights the fact that these individual heuristics, these individual information processing mechanisms operate in a much wider social realm of the environments that surround us. So decision-making is hugely complicated. And the other thing then that makes is that the public, the audience, is hugely complicated. In the top left, we have this is the famous kind of 6 Americas based on the American population, how they feel about climate change. We see on the bottom, the kind of far left, the alarmed group, which is the biggest one, and then we see the different categories down to into the category about 10% kind of more or less rejecting it. And what that tells us is that those 6 different groups reflect 6 very different demographics, different types of people. And they require at least six different types of messaging around, in this case, climate change. So when we are in a disaster risk focus, and here again, I go back to Istanbul, we need to think about who it is we're actually trying to reach. And we often are very lazy about this. We talk about the public or the community as if it's an amorphous, homogeneous group of people, but they're not. And marketers have understood this for many years. Journalists understand this. Communicators of all types understand this. But typically, scientists send out very bland, generic messages and then are concerned about why they don't target individual people. So if we are trying to reach the public's a very diverse set of people. And often it's much more effective, as shown in the bottom right, to be in the community targeting individuals. The man on the right is a Mukhtar, he's a local community representative who knows the people in his community, and those kind of individual information gatekeepers are really important. So rather than targeting the public, it may well be that targeting specific groups of individuals, like in the case of Istanbul, Mukhtars, is far more effective. But that requires you in having a strategy. And this is a really important point to make, which is really that that communication is a process, it's not a product. And too often in project, we see communication has been the bolt-on end effect. We've got all the science, now let's communicate this, as if it's just a set of information that can just get sent along the line. We need to start seeing communication as part of the long-term purpose of our disaster risk strategies. And that requires it to reach out to people, to engage them, and then to motivate them to create change. So I just use, again, a personal example from my work in the bottom left, far left, been involved in popular documentaries, BBC Science about, for example, the seismic threat to Istanbul. But I've also made YouTube videos talking about the earthquake process, earthquake science. But increasingly, in more recent years, the images in Istanbul, the person with the microphone there is my PhD student. That's Johanna. She's a visual anthropologist working with social scientists and anthropologists to try to understand how, for example, film might connect with people. And what you see on the right is a film that Johanna made with some of the scientists in a project that we ran a few years ago, geoscientists, that really targeted a young audience with an animated film around earthquake risk in both English and in Turkish. So we shouldn't just see these things as one-offs. We need to see them as a long-going process. And more recently, what I've got interested in, kind of following in from that, from this intelligence really about what people are worried about, is using virtual reality and computer games by taking the earthquake physics that's happening that we can record and actually implementing that into the game physics of gaming engines so that you can sit in an apartment, a typical apartment. This happens to be modeled on an Istanbul apartment, and you can actually stand in there and experience essentially a realistic representation of the earthquake. And you can modify that with the strength properties of the actual building materials, with the furniture materials, and because it's all represented in the game physics. So I think there's a huge potential here for these immersive environments to actually put people into the situation of earthquakes without having to have them experience in the first place, because one of the things we know is that people who have experienced events are very different communicators to ones who just have heard about them. So what that really leads to is that we need to start having risk dialogues, risk conversations. And I just highlight the statement here that if you're not actively providing information through trusted sources, then more or less someone else is going to be doing that for you, and you may not like what they say. So you should be taking an active part to go into the communities where you think you're having an impact and start to doing that. And This highlights something very much on the back of what Nicola said, which is that we actually know what it is that ordinary people, the public, get upset about in the way that they think about risk. They think about it in a very different way to the way that the specialist does. And I take the work here of Peter Sandman, one of Paul Slovik's students, who basically talks about outrage in terms of community. And he has this, so we think of risk as being hazard multiplied by vulnerability. But he redefines that as hazard multiplied by outrage. In other words, the outrage component is how angry people are about the hazard that they're talking about. And the point that I just want to emphasize here is that we often can't do very much about the hazard. It's sometimes very difficult, given uncertainty, etc., to actually reduce the hazard. But in terms of communication, we can usually do quite a lot about reducing the outrage, the risk that people ultimately feel. And so these sliding scales really are just indicative, but what they basically say is that there's these dimensions to what people consider as making them angry about risks. We've heard some of them, whether they're knowable or controllable, the idea of voluntariness that Nicola talked about, whether they're catastrophic, which tends to stay in the mind, etc., etc. Now, many of those are difficult for individual scientists to adjust to, but actually the ones on the right, the far right, are a little bit more. Responsiveness. How responsive are the experts to views of the general public? How trusted or untrusted are the experts? The notion about the morality of the particular events or how fair it is really important too, and we can help shape that. So the overall message is shown in the bottom left there. Trust, equity, and a sense of control or efficacy are the issues that underlie most risk controversy. So we spend a lot of time talking about the technical work, trying to get across this information, this factual information, where actually some of the more important messages from a scientific perspective, the scientific experts, is our role as trustworthy, fair, and responsive individuals. So I'd like to just then go on to the second part, really, which is how we do that. And in this, again, go back to Sendai, which talks about this people-centered approach. Now, if you look behind the smaller image, talks about the previous approach, top-down approach. In that one, scientific advisors advised the local authorities, and the local authorities talked to the public, talked to the community. There was a very loose connection between scientists and the public, maybe on the media, etc. The people-centered approach, you can see, shows these interactions back and forth between scientific advisors and local authorities on one hand, and also scientific advisors and the public on the other hand, as well as the local authorities and the public. Now, if every arrow is a level of difficulty, you can immediately see that the people-centered approach is much harder than the old top-down approach. So we have a real challenge about how do we do that? How do we train? How do we help the experts work with ordinary people? And the images on the right are taken again from the top one, the Tomorrow Cities project, and the bottom one is an EU project we ran a few years ago, where we took a whole bunch of PhD students into effectively the neighborhoods of Istanbul, met with local people who told them that in this case, earthquakes were not amazing, fantastic things that they associate with, because that's how scientists and geoscientists in particular think of them. Earthquakes are horrible things that kill people and need to be looked at. And these different perspectives are really quite important. So we have to step back a little bit and think about the way that we approach science at the moment. And this is a plot really of scientific production process. So on the vertical axis, we see what is the motivation for the expert. Bottom side, the lower part is it driven purely by a pursuit of knowledge, curiosity-driven science, discovery-led science, or at the top, is it driven by answering some clear problems for society, applied science? And then along the base, along the horizontal, we see to what extent are the end user, in our case, the community or the public, actually involved. Now, for decades, longer than that, centuries, scientists have generally operated in that mode 1 phase, whereby it's about understanding the physical, understanding the world, and not really having any input in from the public. And that's led to the the ideas of publications, research papers being the main means by which we measure our impact, research funding, conferences, etc. But increasingly, and particularly through things like Sendai and the SDGs and Paris Climate Agreement, moving into an acceptance of what's referred to as Mode 2 science, whereby the end user is increasingly driving the process of what scientists should look at. But then there's a space right far out to the top right, which is where actually it's driven by the public. What is it the public wants? And that's referred to as post-normal science, so the idea that we live with these wicked, complex problems that are never going to be solved by individual scientists. We need to look at them around, and stakeholders, end users, need to be part of that process. So it's a case of really moving our mindset, academic mindset or scientific mindset, from publications to public actions. Now, what I've done here is I've superimposed the science communication modes onto this. So what we can see is mode 1, the science communication mode that fits that, is essentially about public understanding, educating the public about science, informing them and entertaining them to some extent about scientific information or scientific phenomena. In the second phase, we have public engagement, which is just connecting with the public, where we're actually trying to influence or persuade them about particular things. We're trying to have behavioral change, for example, around earthquake preparedness. And then as we move into the public actions phase, or the field really, then it's a different process. It's about sharing power and responsibility for action with those communities, and even to the extent of handing over to them our science so that they can evolve much more effective alternatives for themselves. So this is a very different way to envisage the way of the scientific process. Now, I'm going to look at it in, I can go into this more detail if people are interested, but through 3 predominant marketing paradigms. So marketing and advertising, they've known all of this stuff for many years, and the approach of public understanding is basically equivalent to their view of make and sell, where they sell a product, and the selling of that product uses all of the connections and all of the skill sets and devices of essentially journalism and the media. And we've had a lot of that from Nicola. The next marketing paradigm is marketing proper, where you're really trying to understand your audience. Your audience is king. Change your product for your audience. It's referred to as sense and respond, because you want to sense what your audience needs and respond to that need. And that really delves into all of the science that comes from the social and behavioral sciences. And then finally, really that public actions space is what is emerging now is called guide and co-create marketing, with companies that are trying to show social value, to say we're not just in this for the money, we've got a long-term vision, we actually want to make a better world, and we happen to make ice cream if it's Ben & Jerry's, or outdoor clothes if it's Patagonia, but basically we're a nice company, we have good social value, trust us. And that's been much more participatory and community-based. So the point that I want to make in the next 3 slides really is that these are very, very different modes of communication. So if you look at make and sell, the basic assumption here is that the people aren't taking the right decisions because they don't have the right information. Therefore, if science communication is done better, people are going to make better choices. It's referred to as the deficit model thinking. So the goals of science communication is to talk about science, to sell science, to talk about how amazing it is as a way of seeing the world. It's got certain benefits that I'll leave for a minute, but the skill sets that it involves are basically media and journalistic skill sets. It's about speaking without scientific jargon, storytelling and narrative, the importance of imagery. It's about basic media literacy, understanding how the media works and being able to inform it. Media training for experts by press teams and the like, and creating your own creative content, for example, putting stuff out onto YouTube. And so the interactions that those experts will have from the geoscience will be their own media intermediaries, for example, press teams and media centers within their organizations, journalists like Nicola to develop connections and relations with journalists, and then also with their kind of policy advisors and maybe trade organizations or scientific organizations. But if you contrast that with phase 2, sense and respond, it's about knowing who you're trying to reach. And it basically follows this understanding from social science that information is not the thing that actually makes people make decisions. It's people taking account of their values, their beliefs, their internal way of seeing the world. And there's a science to that. There's an empirical science to effective science communication. So the goals here now are about influencing behavioral change. We want people to start thinking about how they can change their house to make it more earthquake proof. We're trying to deliberately move them into a different kind of way of thinking. But it's also about social license, making sure that the community understands and appreciates the work that's getting done, and about engaging with different groups. And again, if I drop to the skills one, what we see there is that it's the skills around the social cognitive understanding, about how we use emotion, motivated reasonings, the idea of cognitive dissonance, etc. It's also about using the skill sets of marketing and the media to segment audiences into different groups that we can target more specifically. It's about the importance of social networks. And fundamentally, it's interdisciplinary working, because if you look at your interactions, you see that now the geoscientist is working with the creative arts and the media, excuse me, they're working with the social sciences, and they're working with the humanities, particularly in ethical dimensions, perhaps with the work that's getting done. But now if you move into the phase 3, the guide and co-create mode, what we see there is a twofold thing, that we need to set out a motivating vision for the work that we do, that we're going to have this science is going to create a better world. But we're also very cognizant that we have to co-create that journey, that path, with the people that we're actually involving. And that also comes with a real focus on us as communicators. What is our intent? What is our personal purpose in the communications that we do? So you see there the goals really about building and sustaining trust among stakeholders. It's a much more pluralized, diversified knowledge base. We're trying to bring in local knowledge and respect it in the same way. So Indigenous knowledge, local knowledge. And then we're also trying to empower those communities to develop their own strategies and solutions independent of us. So the skill set, the skill sets, very, very different. Again, empathy, listening, authentic listening, not instrumentalized listening when you set up something just to pretend you're listening so you can get information across. Dialogues. It's also about how you negotiate and facilitate meetings between very diverse groups, which means a lot of conciliation skills, a lot of stuff around ethical self-reflection. Why am I doing the work that I'm doing? Is it the right thing? And really thinking about theories of change and monitoring and evaluation what we do to be more effective. And in the bottom right then, the interactions that we have as experts are interesting, because it's got an ethical implication for us. As a communicator, am I a facilitator? Do I just want to help people understand the science that's there and they can make their own decisions? Or am I a catalyst? Do I actually have a view on what the actual outcome should be? So I help work it through, and I come upon a particular line that I think the people should take on catalyzing their actions. And then perhaps absolutely most controversially, am I an activist? Am I actually going to immerse myself in that community and actually actively help them transform themselves and create change? And for many people, the role of the scientist becoming the activist is something that's very problematic. And yet within climate change and within biodiversity, etc., a lot of scientists are finding themselves exactly in that position. So really, I just want to leave you then with this model, whereby I think it's a journey. It's most of us, and me, myself particularly, start off in that make and sell place where we want to be a better communicator. That's what we're trying to do. And that is understanding the media and etc. much more effectively. But then at some stage, I think to be that better communicator is a realization that we will be a better communicator if we can understand that communication science and that the way the audiences process information and respond to that. But then ultimately, as we've seen from Sendai, etc., the end game is to work with those people who are going to be affected. And that requires a guide and co-create mentality, and that's interdisciplinary, participatory, and reflexive. And it's very different, as I say, skill sets from what we started with. So I just want to finish there, excuse me, and I talk about, I see these as three separate but evolving sections, whereby essentially what we are doing is around training courses, training courses around science communication for experts, but then also encouraging facilitation with the social sciences and to promote sense and respond. And then finally, embedding ourselves in the very communities that we're talking about in order to facilitate, guide and co-create. And so on that point, I will thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian, for your excellent presentation and lecture. This brought us another perspective and opened our minds to show that this is a process, is a way that we have to follow. And it complemented very well the presentation of Nicola Nocenzo. Now we are going to have the last presentation given by Lucia. I welcome Lucia. And before, let me remind all the attendees that the questions that you may have for the speakers, the previous two ones and also to Lucia, you can ask them in the question and answers, and you can also write comments, and in the final debate period, we will try to cope with them. Okay, so now we have this presentation of Lucia. She's going to talk us about listening before we speak. This was also something that was addressed by Ian, and the title of her lecture finishes as Perspectives on Preemptive Measures for Risk and Crisis Communication. Lucia Herrera did her graduation studies in Colombia and post-graduation in the United States, and she's currently affiliated to the Center for Integrated Emergency Management at the University of Agder in Norway. Lucia has professional experience in digital communications, crisis management, and process improvement in the international private and public organizations. Her research interests include crisis, disaster, and risk management, support technologies and process for agile crisis management, logistics and process improvement, exploring the use of social media as a source of information to support crisis management strategies. Lucia, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for the invitation to come and speak at this webinar. It's really an honor to share the floor with Ian Stewart and Nicola Nocenzo. So let me see if I can share my screen. I hope everyone can see my screen now.
It's okay. Okay.
Okay, so as Dr. Villegas said, the title of my presentation is Listening Before We Speak, Perspective on Preemptive Measures for Risk and Crisis Communications. As Dr. Villegas said, my name is Lucia Castro Herrera, and I'm a research fellow in information systems. I also have professional experience in crisis communications and emergency management, which puts me in a really interesting and unique position in being a bridge between research and practice. So that's with that in mind, I based this presentation on both my experience and what I know from academia. So it's a good blend of both knowledge and kind of like my experience and what I've learned throughout the years as a practitioner. So let me start by saying that we talk about oftentimes about risk and crisis as if they were one concept, when in reality they are two. And these two concepts also influence the way we manage, like risk management, crisis management, which at the same time influence our strategies for communication. So very briefly, Like in this presentation, we understand risk management as identifying, assessing, and mitigating potential harm. This means that we already know the potential of harm or the potential threats, and we do something to manage it. And then on the other hand, crisis management, we refer to it as responding, managing, recovering from an unforeseen event. So that basically is we manage the unknown, or we prepare to manage the unknown. So then in very simple terms, risk communications would be dealing with what we know might go wrong, and crisis communications will be dealing with what effectively goes wrong. Like when and then to put this other concept like disaster communications, it's like, as one of my former colleagues used to say it, disaster is when things start to blow up, basically. So then a little bit illustrating and following the concepts presented by Ian Stewart. Supposedly risk management and crisis management are a cyclical endeavor, but like, really, does that mean that after we did risk management, we move to crisis management? What if there is not a crisis? Risk management and crisis management themselves can also be cyclical. And this is important to know because it's, like as Stuart said, it's a very complex and messy view of crisis management. So for example, there we have our event that is what tells us that we have moved from the part of risk management, like the part of like assessing, early warning, preparedness, and prevention, into a response side. But then like both sides of the cycle are also cycles themselves. So that's really important to have in mind when we are preparing our crisis communication strategies. But then none of this makes any meaning if we don't know our audience and if we don't know the context in which we are operating. So we can have the most amazing communication strategy, but what if our audience does not listen to us in that specific medium? Like, for example, I don't know, a social media platform. So, so this is basically the background or the context in which I'm basing my talk today. So then you wonder, well, where do I start? How do I start listening to my audience or actually getting to know them? And I really like this quote. This is from an interior designer, but it summarizes basically what we do. And it's we have 2 ears, 2 eyes, and 1 mouth, and we use them in the same proportion. And what does that mean? Is that if we treat communications from a service perspective, we focus first on understand and then in acting. So basically, our process will be listening, observing, understanding, and acting. And then, well, then the next question is, well, how can I do that? And then based on my experience and what I've read, like what I know, I've packaged this preemptiveness into 5 different actions, which I'm going to illustrate now. So the first one, so these are the 5 actions. So the first one is counting on your risk assessments. Like I've seen in a lot of institutions that they perform a risk assessment as part of their risk management strategy, but the risk assessment is just sitting as a super big document sitting somewhere and is revised. If revised, is revised every so often, but there is no relationship between the risk and what you're communicating, whether it is during disaster response or whether it is during normal steady state section. So like the risk assessments are a powerful tool and are a source of knowledge because it basically tells you what can you expect. It doesn't tell you when normally, but it tells you what. So it should be a recurrent and it should be updated, of course. And along with updating those risk assessments, you should update. the communication strategies should kind of like align to these assessments. And this tells us specifically what are we willing to accept, because we cannot be protected from everything. So having that threshold of like, well, this is as far as our resources go in order to mitigate our potential risks. So that's it is very useful, and I believe that is one of the things that we should pay attention more into. And like, of course, it's easier to do in a local and maybe micro level than in a national level, but it's still doable. So an example, while I was teaching this semester, an example that I found is the analysis of crisis scenarios here in Norway. And what we can see, like, I'm sorry, it's a little bit small, but like what we can see here in the red is that pandemic was deemed a high likelihood event with high consequences. And this was back into, this is an analysis of back into in 2019. So this tells us that, well, that we could have read, or like maybe like it was read, and then the public authorities or companies could have prepared for this scenario. So like another scenario that doesn't have a much likelihood but like a lot of consequences was an earthquake in a city. And then typical recurrent threat that goes on, for example, here in Norway, that is flooding, is located more or less in the middle of like high likelihood, but not so many consequences. So then if we move into like their analysis of the overall impact scenario, we see that pandemic was the highest one with the highest combination of overall impacts. So that itself tells us a starting point of or how to craft our messaging and our communication strategy. So then we move a little bit in here. I expand a little bit more in the part of knowing your audience from our previous presenter, and this is listening. So we can't do any communication if we don't listen first, and this is a rule of like one-on-one communications all the way into more strategized corporate communications. So here I have, of course, social media listening is my topic of my dissertation. So like, of course, I'm a little bit biased towards it, but it's like social media is a great source of information when used correctly, because like if only a social media profile is set, that is not listening, that is just a dump of information, another source to dump information. So like social media listening is kind of like going into looking into where your audience is in what they are thinking about. And it is not an easy task, as it requires some resources and some knowledge specific to that task. But then social media is not the only source that we have for understanding our audience. Community outreach is another source, and it's based on a more trusting and or of a more strategy to build trust and being more personable into different pockets of the community that we serve as. And of course, like the good old town halls or workshops with people where like anyone interested can come and see what we are doing, or get to know us as an organization or as a public service organization. Then we move over to universality, and this strategy or this part is basically meeting people where they are and not the other way around. So like following that listening side is kind of like looking at where people are. For example, in social media, if we have a profile on Facebook and we think that that's enough, but then like, what if our audience or like half of our audience is not on Facebook, is in other platforms such as Snapchat or TikTok? And like, let's remember that our audience keeps moving depending on their preferences. So we're just like talking to a black box if we don't keep those following those trends. And with universality comes accounting for diversity and vulnerable populations, because for example, when we see that on Facebook, people are talking in general about, especially say like in a disaster area, they need water. But who needs water? What are the populations that need water? Is a general sentiment, or is it a targeted community? And how can we make sure that we take care of the other communities surrounding there? There is a popular example here that is in a given disaster response. Someone noticed that in the disaster response kits that were giving out to survivors, there were nothing for children. There were no products for children nor women. And these are like essential products that everybody should have in case of a disaster or when a disaster happens. So like this gives us an overview that maybe these packages for disaster response are being designed without having a universality perspective and like kind of like a diversity perspective that includes everybody. And the same goes about providing digital services and communicating about digital services. There is nothing worse than talking to a machine that doesn't address your own concerns, and especially in this vulnerable or the populations, like maybe people don't understand the local language. So then how do you reach them and how do you access them if they cannot use your digital tools that are created in another language? This is also true, for example, for elderly population that are not so acquainted or like so adaptable into new digital services. So then we move on into the kind of like building up, and it's kind of like this having or like creating our communication strategies as a two-way conversations. So this one is again based on trust and a display of humanity and compassion. There is nothing better than knowing that there is another person in the other side, like whether it's the other side of Twitter, the other side of a website, and definitely the other side of like a communication statement. So this having this like two-way conversation view makes it so that we build relationships, and this, like I said, it can be both digital and analog. And especially just like as the previous speaker said, it's kind of like you have to kind of adapt the language that addresses, or like you kind of have to talk and speak like your audience receives the message. So it's different if you're addressing collegium of scientists that can understand the nitty-gritty of the problem at hand, as opposed to people that are just that, for example, don't have time to read entire pages of science, and they just need like bullet points. And the same with like vulnerable populations or even kids. So kind of like packaging the messaging into things that they can understand is better. In my opinion, and this is my opinion, I don't have any evidence other than my experience. In my opinion, considering communications as a service and having a service attitude can accomplish this endeavor. So I have an example to illustrate these 3 points, and this I observed in my previous time as a digital communications specialist. I wasn't part of this example, but it was really fun to follow the conversation on social media about it. And this is about the weather forecast that before the weather authorities in the US used to use a software that didn't allow for, that only produced reports on caps, and they were sharing these reports, of course, without any editing. And people in social media and everywhere, but like especially in social media, just like were outraged. And every time they saw one of these reports, they were like, well, stop shouting the weather. And then in 2016, they finally could fix the problem and kind of like upgrade their software and into making like reports that were a little bit more approachable. And that day was a joyous day for everybody who followed the conversation, because we've been waiting. We had been waiting for a more public-friendly communication or weather reports since probably the internet was invented. So in the previous example here, they are talking about a pretty nice day. It was partly cloudy, mostly sunny, and so on. But it sounds very outrageous. It sounds like you're yelling at me and saying that, like, oh, you're going to have sunny days. So then the modification they did here, there is a really, really dangerous winter storm, and now like they just stress the parts where you should pay attention, and then kind of like tone down a bit visually their report. And on that day, so the Twitter conversation was really interesting. And then one user said, like, well, sometimes I need to be yelled at to get for you to get my attention. And then they replied, well, we'll yell when it's really important. And that's another example, like kind of like being where your audience is and speaking their language, and kind of like not kind of like having a one-to-one conversation. And I think I could have come with another example that is kind of like more tragic, but I think this one is a little bit funnier. And then again, in my experience, humor is better or more memorable than other types of content. And then we come to the fifth one, and this one I left it separated because finding balance and knowing your limitation is really hard, and it is very and there is not a formula for this, and it is very context-based. So like for example, too many messages on risk, like, okay, there is a potential for flooding, or there is a potential for a pandemic, or there is a potential, like, be aware, be ready, and all that might desensitize people. But then too little messages people might perceive that you're not present. So that awareness that you are not going to cover everything or everybody is really important in order to respond when things actually happened. And I've noticed that some public service organizations are starting to use marketing strategies, for example, Facebook ads, and that is a really great way, I think, to reach people in a wider spectrum. So much of this is like kind of my personal reflection, that much of the work in disaster risk communications is done in the background and beforehand, before a disaster happens, or like my former colleague used to say, before things start to blow up. And in doing this background work, this preemptive work, we get an awareness of who, how, what, where, and I kind of like the different aspects of the people that we serve to and the people that we communicate with. So then in conclusion, and kind of like to close, wrap up, like it might be a good idea to test the strategies, maybe using focus groups or workshops, or like just plain old conversations, and say like, well, what works better with you? Like, is it better I don't know, to have long text or have videos? How big the videos and so on, and just a reminder that risk communications are indeed cyclical, but like more than cyclical, are like a continuous endeavor, that it doesn't end when a perceived disaster response is over. It continues up till the next event. And it is nice to encourage communities' own responsibility in the message, and kind of like continue to adapt the communication strategies to how the community is moving or the community evolves, and the different interests that the community display. This one is especially relevant when dealing with technology and applications, and kind of like adapting technology into the public services. Well, thank you so much for this opportunity. This concludes my presentation, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Thank you very much, Lucia, for your very good presentation. That concludes this set of 3 lectures. As you know, we are now entering the period of debate. We have some time. There is a place for question and answers where every attendant can put their questions. I see that there are already 2 questions addressed to Ian, but you have seen also that the panel now is enriched by more people, other faces. They come from the project roadmap. They are people in charge of different activities, and they can also take part in the discussion. So the 3 speakers, the 3 panelists, also you can ask questions to each other if you wish. And all I ask you, if you want to speak, is to raise your hand so that I can give you the floor. But as we have now at least 2 questions addressed to Ian, I'd like to invite Ian, if you want to read the questions that you have there and address if possible. Thank you.
You are muted.
Supposed to be a communicator and I can't even press a button. Okay, so so the first one's from Umberto. Hi, Umberto. A long time no see. He's talking about trust and maybe what we should be doing is developing that notion. I think that is I think all the speakers would probably agree trust is the gold dust of communication. If you're trusted, and perhaps we see the negative side of that. If you're trusted too much, then you could be. We're seeing it with all of the kind of misinformation as well, which hasn't been mentioned. But trust is the thing that is really critical in all of this. The trouble is that what I see in science communication workshops with scientists is that they turn up and they say, "How can we be trusted?" And it's a very instrumentalized view. It's like, tell me the 1, 2, 3 in being trustworthy. And what they don't like to hear is that trust is a long-term process of immersing yourself in your audience, and so that you become trusted. And it's not something you can just switch on and switch off. You can lose it very easily. So it can switch off very easily, but it can't be turned on very easily. So I think probably trust, and this is something that I think that can only get done in those pre-event times of quiescence, whereby we should be investing in scientists working and embedding themselves in communities so that they are the trusted go-to people afterwards. And that's a long process. It takes money and it takes resources. It's not very sexy. So that's a bit of a kind of problem there. I'll just quickly talk about the others because I don't want to hold on. Stefan talks about guide and co-create and says it might be challenged because the scientist is entering this other territory. How do you see that? Yes, that is the problem. So there's almost an ethical decision at the start when you decide you're going to communicate of what kind of communicator you want to be. Because I think there is this business that scientists have thus far stepped back, presented technical reports and written papers and said, that's it, I've done my job, my stuff's out there. As soon as you then step forward into the public sphere domain, it's messy and you're going to get involved with communities and politics and things like that. So the only advice I've got is that you should understand those environments as best you can through exactly the mechanisms of saying trust, so that you can make a judgment on what your role is there. But it is very difficult. And I think it should be the subject of deep ethical self-reflection amongst projects like this, whereby you're actually asking the researchers what their role is and how far they've done it. I've done this in workshops where there's complete disagreement across the board about the extent to which they should be involved themselves in this. And it's a personal decision. And I don't know if there's a third one, Domenico. Do you want me to answer that? It's quite a long one. I haven't read it yet. Or shall I? Maybe better at this point to invite some of the others into those issues as well. I'm sure they've got things to say, and then I can go back to Cecilia's one.
Okay, and while you think about the last last question that you have, let me ask Nicola on the case that you presented of the COVID-19 situation. May I ask you, are we learning, let's say, as a community, as a world, on this risk communication from this example of COVID? Do you think what has improved? Are we better now in this process of risk communication?
Well, I'm afraid the picture is a bit mixed. So first of all, as I mentioned in the beginning, the nature of the crisis has changed a lot during these 2 months, during these 2 years. So we've gone to a first phase where the situation was really pretty much the one of a crisis. So in that sense, more similar to the punctual crisis, like you could have, you know, in an earthquake, in a major proper disaster, and then at some point during 2021, we moved to this chronic phase where, you know, we tend to think that we are over the cliff, that the worst is behind our back, and sometimes we feel like we are back at square one. My point is, I am afraid that at this point, the nature of the problems of risk communications have changed quite significantly from the first half of 2020. And I have a feeling that we have learned lessons that we may be able to apply in a new crisis of the kind of crisis we have in the early part of 2020, be it a new pandemic that, you know, we know because epidemiologists tell us that it will happen again sometime, maybe in our own lifetime, maybe in our children's lifetime, but it will happen again, or in other crises and disasters of a different nature. But we are now in a new territory with this kind of chronic, long-term, periodical reworsening of the crisis. And to be honest, by looking around at most national examples, I have a feeling that we have a lot to learn again on how to manage this specific phase that we are on. So maybe that's not too much a reassuring question, but yeah, I think we have learned a lot of useful stuff, and were we able to, I mean, professional risk communicators, policymakers, even journalists, maybe were sometimes slow to learn, but even journalists, were we able to go back to the spring of 2020? Yes, we will know how to do a lot of things better. But we are now facing entirely new problem, and unfortunately, we have to learn again, and we are learning again, I'm afraid. Yeah, there was a small comment I wanted to make since I'm the one speaking on Jan's presentation. I loved both Lucia's and Jan presentations. I thought they were great, and I learned a lot from them. I was interested in the point that he was making on how a participatory communication, one that aims to involve the audience, is fundamentally different from some kind of, you know, typically journalistic communication, let's say the classic journalistic communication where you're delivering a message, the classic, let's say, science outreach, science journalism model. And that is totally true if you take a historical perspective, but let's say to add to the validity of that point, I have to say that also if you look into the media industry today, into actual media outlets, most of them, and the most successful ones, are actually moving towards the same model because it's the only way to survive. And that includes using social media data, like Lucia showed, to know your audience well, to understand what they want, what are their desires, their needs, their personality traits, their values, which is extremely important. And actually finding ways to, you know, to make that exchange that used to be a top-down unidirectional exchange, a bidirectional one. So that's really, you know, like a forced choice at this point for everyone, surely for professionals of risk communication, but actually also the journalistic professional know-how is very much going into that direction.
Can I respond to that? Because I agree completely. And I think that if you're a journalist, actually, journalists and media people are across all three of those simultaneously. My point, I guess, was I was coming at it from the motivation of the expert-driven. And in the expert one, they use make and sell as a passive one-way conduit. So they're not actually, so most journalists are interested in the work that they do, but they want to engage, they want to entertain, and they feel it's a two-way process, and they have connections. And social media has created, as you say, these, particularly with Twitter and things like these communities themselves. But actually, I think what still happens is the experts is an instrumentalized channel. So it wants to learn the tricks and devices of yourself in order to just send that information out. And it's very different from the way that a journalist or a writer would approach that. So I think if you're in the media world, absolutely. But I think if you're out of it in our kind of technical world, we still are very transactional about these processes. So I think that I didn't make that clear. I apologize.
Thank you very much, Shane. I'd like now to address Lucia. You brought this very interesting topic of listening to people. But my question is, during the crisis, how can we speak with the people? My background, I'm a scientist, and my expertise is forest fires. And I've seen that quite often, let's say, during a fire, it's very difficult to address the communication and the people. And very often the media take this whole. And regarding to this, I'd like also to ask you, when you speak about Facebook and these new social media, sometimes I have the feeling that they create new noise, and they can even create more communication that might, let's say, complicate the process. Do you want to comment on this, please?
Yes, absolutely. And well, to your first question, during a fire, it would be really hard to reach people like exactly when it happens, because they will be worried about saving themselves rather than checking Twitter or Facebook or, I don't know, a press release or whatever like communication outlet you're choosing. So that's why I emphasize the point of preemptive measures, and kind of like a lot of these things happen in the background. So ideally, before that fire happens, like so the messaging would have been like, this is what could happen. These are the routes that you can follow in case something happens, and these are the contact informations that you can reach if you need help. So so that would be on that side. Of course, in the part of social media listening, and kind of like that's that is a problem of social media data. That is I describe it as like social media is like this ever living space that houses so many conversations, and then you as a listener, you have to be very clever in a way, or like very knowledgeable into nudging the information that you need, the exact information that you need. But for this, you need tools, and you need that knowledge of how to search information. So it's a different set of capabilities that you need from those of the regular communicator. So having said that, once you find out how to search for information in a specific platform, then it's easier to have your insights. But then we have the problem that now communities tend to go into more intimate social media platforms or social media messaging apps. So in that sense, the strategy turns into being able to have a direct conversation or kind of like getting into those intimate groups, for example, that are formed, those community groups, and kind of like establish a conversation. So so as you see, the kind of like the strategy goes from like a one directional thing where we just talk and talk and talk into kind of like, well, seeing where the people are and narrowing down their conversation into being a part of the conversation and a part of their environment.
Thank you, Lucia. May I now invite Ian to, if you want to address the third comment or question that was made to you. And Nicola, you have also a question in the box, please.
Thanks, Domingos. Yeah, there's the questions from Celia who talks about the financial aspects of this, and particularly in relation to preparedness and retrofitting for seismic risk, and makes the point, that if resources weren't limited, I guess most people would be eager to retrofit their homes. Well, actually, I think the literature on this, the academic literature, suggests that that's a very minor point, that people often, even if they have the money, don't retrofit their homes. Nicola talked about this, some of the heuristics, the shortcuts that people make. It turns out that people often, for example, acknowledge there's a risk, but feel the risk is much higher for other people than for themselves. They're okay. It's the other people that need to take care. And actually, you find nice examples from social scientists looking after, even after the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake, that what happened was people in the area that the earthquake happened, so where essentially the hazard had happened and the risk was lowered, they increased the likelihood to have retrofitting. But the people in the neighboring areas actually didn't have any uptake, and there was no correlation between actual geophysical risks at distance to a fault line and therefore need to retrofit, and the propensity for people to take up the retrofitting, that people did it because of the nature of who they were. So I think as long as we are missing that, then all of the things that follow, all of our information and factual stuff about financial assistance and then policy and how we approach people are going to come to nothing, because we have to understand I think we would see it as the irrationality of the public, but actually it's just an alternative rationality. It's a rationality of the person, and Lucia mentioned that, in the context that they are, they're actually probably making very rational decisions to reflect their circumstances. They're just not the circumstances or the decisions that we expect. So I think there's a lot that we need to learn and glean from those social sciences and communication science. And again, I'd be be great to hear from Nicola and Lucia about how they feel about that kind of aspect.
Thank you. I will first address the question in the chat, maybe in the Q&A tool. So the question is, I described the French map as a good example, but that map went against the official risk map produced by the ECDC. That was supposed to be the standard to be adopted. Don't you fear that a total different representation of risk created even more confusion, says Jorge Gomez? I totally agree, actually. I mean, I was commenting in the slide about the effectiveness of the tool itself, of the, let's say, visual language and communication tool itself. That said, and that also goes back to the previous question about the lessons that we have learned and the others that we still haven't learned yet. It is my personal opinion that lack of coordination and consistency that we often saw during that crisis, that we're still seeing on many points between national and international, so supranational institutions, such as member states and the European Union in this case, between states and their lower administrative level, the regions in Italy, etc. That has been often a problem that hasn't really helped the population. That may be true of the case you are mentioning. That was certainly true in various instances with the conflict between conflict. Maybe it's not always the right word, but inconsistency between the European Medicine Agency and the individual drug regulators. with the travel restrictions that were often not negotiated, not coordinated, and created a lot of confusion and was notoriously difficult for all of us to navigate. So yeah, in that sense, I agree with you with your comment. Of course, in an ideal world, we would have the CDC map applied by all member states without inconsistencies.
Nicola, do you want to address the question from Ian, please?
Oh, can you remind me the question? Sorry, I spoke too much about this one.
I can't remember either now. I think it was about that way that people process information being what experts often think of as being irrational, and actually it's just a different type of rational behavior, I guess.
Yeah, well, there is a point I think I wanted to make about this topic in my presentation, and maybe it's useful to bring it up here again, because in the end I was rushing a bit and didn't mention it. But on the line of what is rational and what is rational, those are always dangerous concepts, because they're a bit oversimplifying. And well, so I think first of all, you have always a key role of trust. I think the first word is always trust. So once a channel of trust is established between institutions and the public, between the professional communicators and the public, let's say you decrease a lot of the probability that messages will be taken in a totally irrational way, etc. So I would focus always first on trust, on organizing communication. And another example of this rational-irrational divide that is maybe sometimes underestimated is, I had one slide in my presentation that taken from, let's say, risk communications good practices in the literature, that said basically panic is a false problem. A lot of very often debatable risk communications choices by institutions, such as not presenting totally the complexity of a risk, and not being totally transparent about the dimension of the risk and the actual level of a risk, or about the uncertainty in the scientific understanding of the risk. It happens very often that people choose not to be entirely transparent on such topics on the ground that if we say everything, people may panic. And actually, a lot of studies tell you that that is really a false problem. People don't panic. Panic is a very rare phenomenon. I mean, if we saw a meteor hinting at us now out of my window, I would panic. But in general, people, even in the face of dangers, do not panic. They worry, but they still, they're still in a position where they can take informed decisions. And so in that sense, I think I would, on one side, credit people to be a bit more rational than they're often supposed to be. And on the other, to always remember that when the relation is established from a position of trust, then this problem can be more easily overcome.
Thank you very much, Nicola. I'd like now to invite Daniela De Bucci. She raised her hand, please, Daniela.
Daniela, your macro is not working again.
Daniela, is there any problem with your macro? Okay, I understand that you are going to type something. In the meantime, if you allow, we will move to Lucia, that has also raised her hand, so you can type without any pressure. Please, Lucia.
Yeah, well, there was a point that Ian made about that people are making decisions. It's just not the decisions that we expect. And that made me think about immigrant communities and kind of like pockets of communities that can be found in other localities. For them, and it ties also with what Nicola was saying about rational decisions. Like for them, for example, during COVID, it was very rational for some of these communities to come together and stay together as a family and just like be agglomerated, like 10 people in one spot. Whereas like our other like rational mind was like, no, just like be separated. So that's interesting to see how different sectors of the communities, or like how different types of communities react to the situation at hand and the situation that is happening. So like here, the most fresh example that we have is COVID-19 and how people reacted to the different stages about that. And it was very different how the general population, for example, here in Norway, as I observed it, like the general population was acting, as opposed to these immigrant pockets of population. So I think that's well connected with that point that Ian was making, and it kind of connects to, again, the point to kind of like knowing those populations beforehand and trying to address them in a way. So for example, I remember someone asked that, well, where is the information in other languages? And some officers said like, well, it is translated in our website. But in order to get to a website, you have to know the local language. So how are you ever going to reach that? So yeah, that's just my reflection on that point.
Thank you very much, Lucia. I don't know, Daniela, are you ready to speak now? Or did you write any message, I suppose? Okay. Well, I don't get to your message, but in the meantime, there is a message in the question and answers from Ilaria Salvi. I think this is addressed to all three speakers, so if you want to read it and address it. But Daniela, where is your...
Daniela's question's in the chat, I've just noticed. I can read it out if it's useful. She mentions two-way interaction is relatively easier at local scale, much more complex at national scale. Any suggestions on how to practically address this challenge, for instance, in the case of a national civil protection? If I have a go at that and then I pass it on, yes, absolutely, it's very difficult. And the reason it's very difficult, as any media person will tell you, is the more specific you can be about your audience, the more easier you can be about how you reach them. If you really understand them, you know what they're worried about, you know their concerns, and you can apply your expertise to that. So trying to scale that up to a national level is always troublesome, and there'll always be areas that is difficult. I think that I'm sure the other two have more useful things to say about this. What I would say is that I think a lot of experts say to me, I don't know what to communicate. I don't know how to communicate. How do I do it? And it's because usually they haven't really thought about who they're trying to reach. And I think that having a better understanding of the audience they're trying to reach will help the individual communications strategy of that. But in terms of how you do it at scale, the one thing that I would say is something I've been involved in recently is the climate assembly, citizens' assemblies, where individuals, normal people work through really quite complicated problems and actually show a real deep ability to connect and understand those problems and make rational decisions. So it kind of goes back to what Nicola says. I think when we give people the opportunity, they actually show that they really understand what we're trying to get at, including things like uncertainty and all the rest of it. But it provides a different grammar, a different language to the interaction. But maybe I'd be interested to hear what others think on that.
Yeah, from my side on this question, I totally acknowledge the difficulty. The only way I see, and it is not necessarily an answer that makes it easier, because of course it has organizational, logistical difficulties into it, but the only way I see is to, make the national scale a collection of smaller scales, points where you are able to interact with the communities and to establish exchanges with local communities. Also, I have to say, at least in the COVID example about which I've focused today, but I think you can make the case for many other kinds of crises. I think we have learned that the local level is very important. I mean, it's the more you scale up to the national level, not to mention the continental level, the more information you lose, and the more you lose track of how different communities with different values, with different socioeconomic situations can react significantly different to the crisis, and so have very different information to provide to you. So I think in an ideal world, any national institution that has to deal with should find ways to delegate to local chapters that are somehow able to interact with local communities, and then compose a picture that that does not necessarily abstract from the very strong specificities that you can have at the local level in terms of response to the crisis. And it's terribly difficult. I mean, I have no because it's an organizational problem. It has many angles to it, but let's pretending for a moment that there is that it's easier to do it than what it actually is. I think that would be the way forward.
Thank you, Nicola. Lucia, do you want to comment about this point? Please?
Yes, so it is more or less on the same lines about tapping into the local abilities, or like the local closeness to potentially affected people. That is probably the way I would see this problem to go. So like from a civil protection perspective, like kind of like tapping into collaboration strategies with the local agencies. I don't know exactly how your organization is set up, but I'm imagining there's a national civil protection. There are like little civil protection localities in different parts. And then kind of like having a conversation, but beyond that, maybe tapping into simulations or exercising and kind of imagining like, what if one of the risks that we are afraid to becomes a reality? How would we address people? How can we, like, and now I'm saying we, but like, how can the national civil protection support better the local communications into addressing these people? So I feel like that's one side, and then the other side is kind of like the two-way interaction is probably being available as an organization and being open to having a conversation with different pockets of the population. That's my 2 cents.
Thank you, Lucia. Mauro, please.
Thanks, Xavier, and thanks to all the speakers, because they made very appreciable presentations on the same topic, but with different points of view. So thanks, Nicola, Yain, and Lucia. I have some questions, but I will just put one about the contradictions that there are within the scientific community. Of course, different points of view have always existed within the scientific community, and in the past they were restricted within the scientific community. But with the increase of the media communication, especially social media in the last decades, the problem is that scientists try to find shortcuts, and this can be very dangerous, as you see, not because there are contradictions, but because they cannot be understood by the large public. So I would like to ask you if you see any possibility of improving the situation on this aspect, because very often information that should be addressed to scientific magazines are instead addressed into social media or communication media. Thank you.
Maybe I start, and
Okay.
then I think it's a topic on which we have all opinions. But so in terms of the contradictions and, let's say, the crowded nature of scientific opinions that we have seen, especially in some countries. I mean, I mentioned the example of Italy because it wasn't the only one, but it was particularly significant. Well, first of all, I mean, this has been a topic of debate in the scientific community, in the journalistic community, etc. So sometimes when people suggest that, you know, scientists should talk less to the media, that these contradictions and difference of opinions should be less visible to the public, then the person suggesting this idea is very easily accused of wanting to censor, you know, to use censorship towards opinion, etc. So first of all, I think we must, well, this is totally a personal opinion, but I think we should draw a clear line between scientists who are speaking in their own capacity, representing themselves as experts, and scientists who, in that specific moment, have an official role, either as members of official committees, as official advisors to the policymakers, etc. So, at least in this second case, I really believe that more coordination of messages and limiting the number of people who speak on behalf of the decision makers, on behalf of the government or whatever, is a better choice. So in that case, for example, in Italy, I think there was a little bit too many subjects that had an institutional role, and that in addition to the institutional role, were speaking regularly to the public. So in my opinion, that was a communicator mistake. That has nothing to do with censorship. But then on the other hand are the scientists who give interviews. And that also has a lot, I mean, you can't discuss that without discussing the responsibility of the media system itself, because in that case, that depends a lot on how the media, and again, there are very specific national differences, I believe, the way the media use experts and how much they rely on having different voices to give variety, diversity to their coverage with possible negative results. Again, I go back to the difference between Italy and Switzerland, because they happen to be two countries I know very well, because I come from one and I currently live in the other one. So in this respect, during the first phase of the pandemic, the two countries were extremely different, because in terms of official communication, the difference was striking. I mean, Switzerland was literally speaking with two people, while in Italy we had a bit more. I have to say there was really a lot of difference on the media side as well, because despite Switzerland not lacking top universities, top institutions, and scientists who probably had interesting things to say, the media tended to not interviewing 3 different people every day. And that's just a choice that depends on how the local professional habits of the journalist works. But this is just to say that I mean, personally, I will never invoke limitations to the right of experts to speak to the media whenever they like. But there should be a clear line perceivable by the audience on who speaks for themselves and who speaks for the authorities in an official role.
If I can add to that, I think it's a real problem. And I think it's a problem that's got worse, funnily enough, as scientists have been encouraged to communicate to the public by their universities, by their institutions, and by their press teams who push them out there. I think, though, it's a problem that's really particularly acute in the crisis. I mean, Lucia mentioned that risk and crisis one, but in the crisis moment, that's when it's really critical. I think in the earlier phase, when it's a bit quiet, I think the public are quite tolerant of scientists and experts disagreeing with each other, but they're less tolerant of it in crisis mode. And, you know, it strikes me right now, there's a volcano erupting in Java. The social media feed is full of volcanologists talking about this eruption. Now, it's interesting because they've got their own Twitter kind of community and they're talking amongst themselves. But of course, amongst that are lots of people in the public and lots of journalists. And so what it's doing is it's creating this kind of noise. And it's interesting, that community, I think more than some of the other disaster risk communities, have recognized that. And actually, what you'll find is quite a lot of the feeds, the volcanologists are saying, listen to what the Indonesian authorities are saying. This is what you need to do. And they're reinforcing the actionable risk messages on the ground. But equally, there'll be a whole bunch not who'll be saying, this isn't the big one's not as big as this, or talking about the dangers that pyroclastic flows have, which is absolutely terrifying if you're on the ground. So I think we have to have a moral and ethical responsibility as a group of scientists about when and where we get involved and when we stay out. And I would argue very much that in emergency management, we should stay out.
Thank you very much, Ian. Lucia, I don't know if you want also to address this question.
Well, like both Nicola and Ian said, this is a very complex question and a complex issue to solve. Not only because, of course, like in the scientist community, we want to like make our voice and kind of like show how much we know and how we contribute to the society. And then on the other side, there is media trying to report things, report facts, but also kind of trying to construct a story. And when these two merge, it is incredibly complicated to discern what is real. And then just like the decision, the making decisions point that we talked about, there are different realities or different truths in a way, or different ways to tackle a problem. So I completely agree with Ian, and I think that it is a responsibility as scientists or like as communicators to give the word to those who are the experts in this case. So in the case of the volcano, to the emergency management authorities in Indonesia, those are the people who actually know what's going on site. And those are the people who know actually what measurements need to be taken to carry on the people safely into safe and secure places.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much to all. I think now it's time to close. We are reaching at the end of our time. And before giving the floor to Andrea Prota, the coordinator of the project, to say the closing remarks, from my side, I would like to thank all of the speakers for the excellent conference that you gave and lots of food for thought that you provided us. And I'd like to ask also the attendees for their presence and their interest. I can count that around 180 people followed this webinar from the beginning, which I think is quite good given the number of initiatives that you have nowadays. I would like to thank to all the members of the consortium roadmap, and in particular to the colleagues of my team who supported me in preparing this meeting. We see that we have received lots of comments, many positive ones, and we thank also the audience members for that. And this encourages us to go on with these sort of initiatives. From my side, that's all. I'm sure that I'll not meet you before Christmas, so I wish you all a good Christmas from my side. Please, Andrea.
Thanks, Domingos. I confirm that by reading the chat, I'm very delighted that all the attendees are showing appreciation for the topic we selected, for the contents of the presentation and of the discussion. So really great thanks to our speakers, Lucia, Jan, and Nicola. I use the first names to thank them, and as well as to the partners of the project. Again, a special thanks to the team of ADAI, led by Professor Domingo Šviegaš, who organized and managed this webinar. I think the presentation and discussion will feed and will guide further our thought about the definition of the solution explorer, of the contents of the further activities that Roadmap project will do in the next month. So I thank you again, and I invite you to follow the developments of this project on the website. And also from my side, I wish you Merry Christmas and all the best for the new year. And we'll keep going for sure. The results of this webinar will be very useful and of benefit to the project. So thanks again, and a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.